The mountain has a way of speaking to those who choose to live upon its quiet shoulder, and for a man who spends his days walking through snow that reaches his knees and winds that scrape along the ridges like invisible hands, that voice becomes a steady I remember the first mornings after I arrived here for good, when the cold air tasted so sharp that my lungs felt as if they had been polished from the inside. I would stand outside my small wooden shelter before the first light broke open the sky and feel the mountain breathing with me. There was an unmistakable understanding in that moment, a silent agreement that I was welcome here if I respected the land, the weather, the solitude, and the pace of a world far older than any memory It is in this stillness the story of the man and the ice begins, a story that may sound simple on the surface, but is woven with the kind of meaning that only reveals itself to those willing to sit with it long enough to hear its deeper echo. You might have seen the way people react when they encounter something they do not recognize or understand. They laugh, they doubt, they point, and they place their confidence in whatever the majority accepts as true. That is how it was in the valley below, long before anyone here bothered to learn how patience works when your life depends on rivers that freeze, winds that change direction without warning, and fish that move through the icy water with instincts far older than human pride. The man I speak of had been living alone on this mountain for years, perhaps longer than anyone could easily recall. He was not a figure of mystery or legend in his own eyes, though the villagers liked to tell stories about him around their shared fire. They said he was strange, stubborn, quiet, and overly fond of spending entire seasons without speaking to another soul. They imagined him as a lonely figure wandering between cliffs and frozen lakes, a man who must have lost something important in life to choose such isolation. But they were wrong in every possible way, because the mountain had not been a refuge for his sorrow, but a home chosen out of love. He adored the crisp quiet of winter mornings, the sound of the snow settling in the night, the slow melt of spring that carried the scent of earth waking up, and the profound feeling of belonging that came from knowing that nothing here tried to be anything other than it was. The mountain never pretended. It was honest, sometimes harsh, but always fair. And in that fairness, he found a sense of balance he had never felt. People often misunderstand solitude. They imagine it as emptiness or exile, when in truth, solitude can become a deep well of clarity for those who seek it with open. This man was not escaping the world. He was embracing part of existence that many never experience. Every day but because he loved transition from dark to dawn. He would gather the firewood he chopped in advance, brush the thin layer of frost from the tools he kept outside, and walk down to the lake that rested in a hollow between two old ridges. This lake was fed by underground water and stayed alive even in the deepest cold, though its surface often froze into a mirror so clear that he could see his reflection staring back at him as if another version of himself lived just beneath. The villagers came to fish here each winter, carrying their nets, their confident habits passed down through generations. They liked to shout loud greetings to each other across the frozen surface and tease whoever caught the fewest. They believed they knew the lake better than anyone, and perhaps they did in their own way, for they had grown up around it, throwing stones into its water as children and learning the patience required to pull life from beneath its surface. But their knowledge was shaped by convenience and tradition, not by the kind of attention that comes from living on the mountain. The man had studied the movement of the fish for years, watching how they responded when the temperature shifted or when the wind blew from the north instead of the west. He had noticed how they preferred certain shadows, certain hours, He knew that fish, like people, move differently when they feel safe. It was during one particularly long winter that he crafted something new. He had been observing how the ice changed density across the lake, and how the fish clustered beneath the faintest cracks where the water below remained slightly warmer. The villagers always cast their nets where the lake seemed wide and deep, assuming the greatest catch must be found in the grand space. But the man had learned that it does not always gather where humans expect it. Sometimes it thrives in the narrowest, quietest corner, away from noise, disturbance. And so he designed a method that did not rely on force but on understanding. He shaped blocks of frozen water in the night, letting them harden under the cold moonlight. He carved small openings inside them, using only the tools he had carried for years, tools that had become almost extensions of his own hand. These openings created a pathway through which the fish could swim, providing them with a chamber of safety. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a lump of frozen matter, perhaps a neglected chunk of lake ice, but within that simple shape was an invitation to life, a structure that allowed fish to rest without fear of sudden nets pulling them away. When he first placed it in the water, letting it sink just below the surface, he did not expect anyone to notice. He was creating something for himself, a way to honor the lake he loved, a method to take only what he needed without disturbing the delicate balance of this place. Yet news travels quickly among those who pass time watching others, and soon enough a group of villagers came to see what he was doing. They laughed. We saw a strange iced structure sitting in the water, a misplaced stone. They teased him, calling it unnecessary, odd, or useless. They bragged about their nets and the tradition that had served them for generations. The man smiled calmly, not offended at all, because he understood something they did not. Mockery is often born from a place of insecurity, and he had long ago freed himself from the need to prove anything to anyone. He simply nodded and continued his work. He trusted the mountain, the lake, and the years he had spent observing every small detail of this environment. He did not need validation from those who visited, only on occasion. In the following days, the villagers returned to their usual fishing spots and threw their nets across the water. Some days they caught enough fish to fill their basket, but other days they struggled, partly because the winter had been unusually harsh and the fish were moving more cautious. Meanwhile, the man checked the small iced structure he had placed in the lake, lifting it gently and observing the life sheltered within. To his quiet satisfaction, it held more fish than he had anticipated, not because it trapped them in the usual sense, but because it offered them a temporary sanctuary. The fish entered freely, drawn by the subtle warmth that collected within the hollow he had shaped. Once inside, they lingered, moving slowly in a place that felt, and when the time came for him to gather what he needed, he did so with gratitude, taking only enough to sustain him. The icy structure was not a tool of greed, a gesture of respect toward the lake. It worked with the rhythm of nature rather than against it. Eventually, word spread that his strange creation had caught more fish than any net that season. The villagers returned, not with laughter, but with curiosity thick in their voices. They wanted to see how it worked, how something so simple and quiet could outmatch methods that had been relied upon for decades. Some still doubted, thinking perhaps it was luck or exaggeration, but those who observed the structure closely understood it was not luck at all. Care. It was patience. It was attention to the details most people never bother to notice because they are too busy rushing or comparing or trying to impress. The man explained none of this because explanations are wasted on those unwilling humility. Instead, he continued his work, letting the results speak for themselves through the steady rhythm of life beneath the ice. And as I tell you this now, I wonder if perhaps you have felt something similar in your own life. Maybe there was a moment when someone doubted your eye or the quiet way you chose to move through the world. Maybe you have known the feeling of being underestimated simply because you preferred observation over noise. If so, then you will understand why this story matters. It reminds us that wisdom grows in silence and that the simplest answers often reveal themselves only when we stop trying to force them. The mountain taught this man these truths long before he shaped that piece of ice, and the lake echoed them back each. And perhaps, as you listen to this from wherever you are, you can feel a small piece of that calm settling inside you, reminding you that your journey has its own rhythm, its own pace, its own quiet power, waiting to be seen. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Feel the world gathering around this mountain through your presence. He had not always lived in the mountain, though when people saw him now, they could hardly imagine him anywhere else. Before this life of silence and frost, he had belonged to a world full of noise, promises, and confusion. There had been days of routine and ambition, the kind that make people wake before dawn, not because they loved the morning, but because they fear falling behind. He worked with his hands then too, though not in the honest way the mountain required. Back in the valley, his work had been tied to machinery, schedules, to the endless ticking of clocks that ruled the lives of men. Every sound carried urgency. Even the wind that passed between the narrow seats seemed to hurry. There was no time to breathe, no space to listen to the inner rhythm of one's own heart. He had lived that way for years, convincing himself that this was what a man, that survival meant submission to a system that measured worth by exhaustion. The truth is that his journey to isolation began not with a single event, but with a slow erosion, the way water wears down a stone until it becomes something else entirely. He began noticing small things that no one else cared to see, the look in people's eyes, dreams, but act as if they were already the way laughter in the city sounded like it was bouncing off invisible walls. He would sit sometimes at the edge of the market square, watching people rush past without ever really seeing one another, and he would feel something inside him tighten, as if a thread that once connected him to that life had begun to fray. He was not bitter. He did not hate those people. He simply recognized that he no longer belonged among them. There had been love once, too, a quiet kind of love that he believed would last through every season. But love, when not nourished by presence, dries like a leaf in late autumn. She was kind, patient, but restless in ways he could never be. She needed company, laughter, a sense of movement. He needed silence, reflection, and the kind of stillness that allows one to listen to hidden language. For a time, they tried to bridge that distance. She would follow him into the hills during summer and admire his way of sitting for hours. But as the years passed, her admiration turned to confusion, and her confusion to sadness. She could not understand why he needed to disappear for days, why he preferred the sound of rain on rock to the comfort of conversation. And when the day came that she told him she was leaving, he did not stop her. Not because he did not care, but because he loved her enough to let her seek the rhythm that matched own soul. After she left, he walked without direction for a long forest, along dirt paths, past villages where no one knew his name. He carried little with him, a knife, a small pot, a blanket, and a notebook he rarely wrote in. He was not searching for a place. He was searching for the absence of noise, a place where thought could move freely again. The journey eventually led him upward, into the embrace of the mountain would become his home. The first night he slept there, he built a fire beside a frozen stream and listened to the silence pressing gently around him. That silence was not empty. It was alive, filled with the deep hum of the earth turning, of unseen creatures breathing, snow, stars whispering light. In that moment, he understood that he had finally arrived. At first, the life he seemed unbearable to anyone who might have watched him from afar. The days were long and brutally honest. There was no comfort beyond what he built himself. Food had to be earned through labor, warmth through endurance, and rest through discipline. But he did not see hardship as suffering. He saw it as purification. The mountain stripped away every unnecessary layer until all that remained is truth. And truth, when left alone long enough, becomes a kind of peace that cannot be explained. Over time, he learned to read the landscape the way others read books. The tilt of a cloud told him how long the storm would last. A pattern of snowflakes revealed the temperature that would come by morning. Even the way the wind moved between the pine trees spoke to him like an old friend. There were moments of doubt, especially in the early years. He sometimes wondered if he had chosen too much solitude, if perhaps the human heart required more than the company of wind and stone. But then he would remember the world he left behind, the endless noise that left no room for thought, and he would feel gratitude instead of regret. He realized that loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of connection. Here, surrounded by the quiet majesty of nature, he felt connected to everything. The mountain did not speak in words, but its lessons were constant. When the snow fell, it reminded him that beauty and hardship often arrive together. When the river thawed each spring, it showed him that life renews itself even after the harshest cold. In the village below, people whispered stories about why he had come. Some said he was running from something dark. Others believed he was mad. A few pitied him, thinking he must have lost his mind to trade comfort for solitude. Yet there were those who envied him, though they would never admit it. They saw in his quiet strength a reflection of what they had once desired for themselves, but had long abandoned. Every time they saw the smoke from his chimney rising straight into the cold air, they felt a small stirring in their chests, a reminder of a different kind of freedom. One winter, a young boy from the village climbed the mountain seeking to trade some supply. The boy was curious and unafraid, and when he saw the man's simple cabin, stared in awe. The man welcomed them, offering tea made from dried herbs gathered before the first frost. The father spoke politely but hurriedly, eager to return to the safety of the valley before nightfall. The boy, however, asked questions. "Why do you live so far away? Don't you get lonely? What do you do when it snows so much that you can't even see the sky?" The man smiled and answered each question with patience. He told the boy that loneliness is a matter of perspective, that snow's not an obstacle, but a teacher, and that when one lives close to nature, every difficulty becomes an opportunity to understand something deeper about one. Years later, that same boy would grow into a man and remember those words each time life in the valley became too loud. He would tell others about the hermit on the mountain who taught him that peace is not found escaping the world, but by facing it in its purest form. And perhaps that is how stories of the man and his ice trap began to spread so far, not through the man's own telling, but through the quiet reverence of those who had felt the weight of his presence. The mountain did not demand his isolation. It offered it as a gift. He accepted it willingly, not to reject humanity, but to rediscover solitude. He found compassion. When you spend enough time listening to the world without speaking, you begin to hear the struggles of others in the silence itself. The cries of birds during a storm, the bending of trees under snow, the cracking of ice at dawn, all of it reminds you of the fragility of it. He often said to himself that if people could sit still long enough to hear the mountain breathe, they might learn to forgive more easily. Sometimes spring came early. He would walk down toward the valley to trade dried herbs, crafted tools, or smoked fish for salt and oil. The villagers still looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Children whispered stories, and adults nodded respectfully but distantly. Yet he was never bitter. He understood that everyone has their own kind of mountain to climb, even if they never leave the valley. His was simply more visible. The climb, after all, is only symbolic. What matters is the willingness to rise above the noise and listen. If you have ever felt the need to step away from everything for a while, to silence the constant demands of life and rediscover what your heart really wants, then you already understand the man's choice. He was not special or extraordinary. He was simply honest about what he needed. That honesty frightened people because it reminded them of their own unspoken desire. Sometimes the greatest rebellion in a world that glorifies noise is to choose silence and live it completely. He did not miss the city lights or the crowded rooms. He missed, occasionally, the sound of another voice. But even that longing faded. When the wind carried through the pines a certain tone, it sounded almost human, almost familiar, as if the world itself were whispering back to him. And in that sound, he felt companionship, the kind that no crowd could ever provide. If you have listened this far, you might begin to see the mountain not just a place, but as a mirror. Every one of us has a mountain somewhere within, a place where truth waits quietly to be acknowledged. The man simply chose to live upon his, and though people mocked his solitude just as they mocked his ice, they never understood that both were born from the same thing, understanding rather than defiance. If you feel the pull of this silence, if something in this story stirs a small wish for peace within you, take a moment now to breathe and remember that you too can find your own quiet place, even in the middle of the world's noise. And if you wish to keep hearing stories like this one about life, the mountain, and the hidden wisdom inside solitude, make sure to subscribe so you can continue walking beside me through these silent reflections. He often said that silence is not the absence of sound, understanding. It took him years to reach that realization. At first, the quiet pressed against a weight. The wind would move through the trees. Instead of comfort, he would hear empty. The creaking of the cabin walls during long winter nights would echo like distant voices, reminding him of what yet with time formed. The wind became conversation, cracking wood became rhythm, and even the distant howls of wolves became music. He learned that everything in nature speaks, though never in the language of men. Once he began to listen properly, the silence of the mountain revealed itself as a living orchestra, subtle and profound, where every element contributed its own verse to the great hymn of existence. His days followed the slow pulse of the season. There were no alarms, no schedules. He woke when his body told him to, usually before dawn, when the sky still held the pale blue of early morning. He would light the small stove, melt a bit of snow for water, and brew tea with dried leaves he had gathered months before. The first sip always carried the taste of memory, a reminder that patience bears the sweetest fruit. Then he would step outside, letting the cold air kiss his face. Some mornings the fog would hang low, swallowing the world in a white dream. Other days the light would stretch far and clear, painting the valley below in golden hues. He had no one to greet, one to impress, yet each morning felt like a meeting with life. His work changed with the season. In winter, he spent much of his time near the frozen lake, maintaining the trap, checking fish, carving new tools. In spring, he planted small patches of hardy vegetables in soil he had slowly enriched with ashes and fallen leaves. Summer brought repair, collection, and long walks across the ridges, where he gathered herbs, mushrooms, and berries. Autumn was a time of preparation, when every action revolved around the coming cold. The rhythm of this life was slow but full. It left no space for idleness or boredom, because everything he did carried meaning. Every act of survival was also an act of gratitude. People often think that solitude erases the need for care, that when you live alone, you live carelessly. The truth is the opposite. When you live in silence, you begin to see how delicate everything really is. A fire left untended can die in minutes. A careless step on ice can break a bone and change your entire season. Every movement, every breath becomes intentional, and that awareness slowly expands beyond the practical. He began to sense the same care needed for his inner life. He watched his own thought like he watched cloud passing, shifting, never permanent. Anger, sadness, longing all came and went like storms, and he learned to let them do so without resistance. That was the greatest gift the mountain offered, the ability to live with constant reaction. Sometimes he would spend entire afternoons sitting by the lake without doing anything at all. The world below the surface fascinated him. He knew where the fish hid when the temperature dropped, how they followed the slow-moving currents that the eye. He began to see a reflection of himself in those creatures. They moved with quiet purpose, trusting the unseen forces of the water, while those who chased them with nets often failed to notice the deeper flow beneath. Watching them, he understood, not waiting. It is moving at the pace of life itself. There were storms, of course, the kind that remind you how small you really are. He would hear them coming long before they arrived, the wind rising like an angry spirit across the peak. The trees would bow, the snow would swirl in blinding circles, and the cabin would groan under the pressure. In those moments, he felt no fear, only respect. Storms were the mountain's way of speaking in a louder voice. When the fury passed, he would step outside into a world reborn, everything covered in an untouched whiteness so pure that it made the heart ache. The silence after the storm was the kind that makes you believe in eternity. He sometimes thought about the world below, the villages, the people, the endless exchange of words and desires. He did not despise them. He simply did not need them. Yet there were times when he missed the simplest things: laughter, the scent of bread baking, sight of firelight through another person's window. He did not deny these longings. He allowed them to pass through him like the wind passes through the trees. In doing so, they lost their power. Desire becomes gentle when it is observed rather than obeyed. One evening, while the sun was sinking behind the western ridge, he sat outside watching the colors change. The sky burned with crimson and gold, and the lake caught every hue, turning it into a mirror of fire. He thought about time, about how people spend their lives chasing more of it, never realizing that it cannot be. He realized that what truly matters is not how much time one has, but how deeply one lives within each moment. The mountain had taught him that depth is worth more than duration. He had visitors now and then, hunters, travelers, or curious wanderers drawn by rumor. Most came only once. They expected stories, secret, or some hidden knowledge of the wilderness. What they found instead was simplicity. He would share food, offer a place to rest, and listen more than he spoke. Some left disappointed, others transformed. One man told him later that the quiet in his cabin had changed the way he thought about life, that in those few hours' stillness he had seen how much noise he carried within himself. The mountain, the hermit, the silence, they acted as mirrors. The man did not think of himself as wise. He only lived according to what felt true. But truth, when lived fully, radiates outward, whether one intends it or not. He noticed that the animals around him became calmer with the years. The birds nested closer to his cabin. The foxes no longer fled at his scent, and once even a deer stood within a few feet of him, staring with soft, unafraid eyes. It was as if the mountain itself had accepted him completely, absorbing him into its rhythm. There was a strange beauty, smallness of his world. Each object, each gesture carried meaning. The sound of his knife against wood while carving a new handle, the creak of the floor as he stepped toward the fire, the hiss of water meeting hot metal. These were the symphonies of his days. He did not crave more because he already lived inside abundance, not abundant possession, but of awareness. And yet even here, in this perfect balance, he continued to learn. The mountain never stopped teaching. There were winters harsher than others, when food ran low and frost crept into every corner. There were springs when the meltwater flooded his garden, and summers when smoke from distant fires filled the. Each hardship carried its own lesson. He discovered that peace is not the absence of difficulty, the ability to remain steady through it. At night, he would sometimes lie awake, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. The stars beyond his small window shimmered with a kind of clarity only seen from the heights. In those moments, his mind wandered far beyond the mountain. He thought about how people everywhere live under the same stars, how each light above him was seen by countless others who might never meet. It comforted him to think that silence connected them all in ways they could not. Once, a traveler asked him if he ever grew tired of being alone. He smiled and said that no one who has truly met themselves can ever be lonely again. That answer stayed with the traveler, who repeated it often when he returned to the valley. Words spoken from silence have a way of traveling farther than those shouted from crowds. Years passed, though the man barely felt their weight. He marked time not by calendars, but by the migration of birds, the cycle of snowmelt, and the slow growth of moss on the stones outside his door. His beard turned white, his hands rougher, but his eyes brighter, filled with the calm of someone who has made peace with everything he cannot control. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the rhythm of his days, the crunch of his boots on frozen ground, the sigh of wind through the pine, the crackling laughter of firewood giving into flame. In those sounds lives a truth the modern world has, that joy is not found in but in awareness. The man who once walked away from all noise had not lost anything. He had simply remembered what it means to be alive. And perhaps that is why his story continues to echo through time, because somewhere within each of us lies the same longing to strip away the noise, to breathe with the mountain, to live without the constant chase. If you've ever dreamed of such stillness, then you already understand the man who built an ice trap and found not only fish, freedom. Now, before we move to the next part, take a quiet moment to notice your own silence wherever you are. And if this story has touched you so far, take a second to leave your mark here, subscribe, stay close, and keep walking with me as we journey deeper into the heart of this mountain. It was in the heart of winter that the mountain decided to test him. The sky had remained gray for days. The wind carried a strange heaviness, and even the animals had gone silent, hiding deep within their burrows. He could feel the shift long before it arrived, not through any dramatic sign, but through the quiet intuition that grows in those who pay it. The air thickened with that peculiar calm that always precedes storm, and when the first snow began to fall, did not stop. Hour after hour, day after day, the flakes descended endlessly, swallowing the world in white silence. At first, he welcomed it, as he always did, lighting his fire and preparing for a few days of isolation. But the snow did not relent. It piled against the walls of his cabin until the windows disappeared beneath its weight. The path to the lake vanished, and even the familiar sound of the trees bending in the wind was replaced by an eerie stillness. The mountain, which had always been his ally, now seemed to close in around him, demanding something he didn't understand. He spent the first nights feeding the fire constantly, melting snow for water, and rationing his supply. The storm grew so fierce that it shook the roof, threatening to rip it away. He reinforced it with heavy logs and rope, working by the dim light of his lantern. There were moments when he wondered if this was the end, not out of fear, but out of humble recognition that even the strongest man is only a guest in nature's house. Yet deep inside, he knew that the mountain never tests without purpose. It teaches through experience, not through words, and its lessons are always earned through endurance. On the fourth night, when the wind finally began to soften, he stepped outside to survey the damage. The world was unrecognizable. Hills, rocks, trees, all buried under thick waves of snow that glistened under the pale light of a half-hidden moon. The lake was invisible, covered by a sheet of ice that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. As he looked across that frozen expanse, he noticed something strange, a faint sound, like a whisper beneath the surface. He knelt down, pressing his ear to the ice. There it was again, a distant, rhythmic pulsing, unlike anything he had heard before. The sound was alive. Curiosity guided him forward. He brushed away the top layer of snow and saw that the ice, though solid, had formed in peculiar pattern. Beneath it, the trapped air bubbles seemed to move slowly, shifting as though something below was breathing. He realized storm had changed the lake's structure. The heavy snow and sudden drop in temperature had sealed parts of it off from the flow of water beneath. The fish were now trapped in isolated pockets, struggling to find oxygen. The man understood immediately what had to be done. He would need to reopen the pathways under the ice, not only to save the fish, but to restore the lake's balance. The task was dangerous. The ice was unpredictable, and the cold could kill in minutes through. But he did not hesitate. He gathered his tools, tying a rope around his waist and securing the other end pine near the shore. Each step across the frozen surface creaked like a warning, but he moved with steady precision, testing the ground before shifting. When he reached the center, he chose a spot where the sound beneath was strongest. His axe struck the ice again and again, the blows echoing into the stillness like heartbeat. When the hole finally opened, a rush of cold air escaped, followed by a bubbling surge of dark water. For a moment, he simply watched, listening as the trapped oxygen flowed upward, releasing the lake from its suffocation. Then he carved more openings, small and spaced carefully apart, restoring the natural breathing of the water below. As he worked, he noticed movement in the depth, a shimmer, a flicker of silver life returning. The fish was stirring again, drawn to the new current. He smiled softly, feeling that familiar sense of connection that always came when he acted in harmony with the mountain. But just as he turned to return to shore, the rope around his waist jerked violently. The ice beneath him cracked, splintering with a deafening sound. Before he could react, the surface gave way and plunged him into the freezing darkness. The cold was absolute, an immediate and merciless force that clamped around his body. For a few seconds, he could not tell which way was up or down. Instinct took over. He fought against the weight of his soaked clothes, searching for the faint light above. The rope tugged at his waist, reminding him of the lifeline that still connected him to the world above. He pulled with all his strength, lungs burning, vision narrowing. At last, his hands broke through the surface, and he gasped as the night air filled his chest like fire. He dragged himself onto the ice, trembling violently, knowing that every second counted. Hypothermia moves quickly in such cold. He forced himself to crawl toward the pine, each movement slower than the last. The world blurred, the snow gleaming too bright, the air too thin. But somehow, through will or perhaps through the mountain's own mercy, he reached the cabin. Inside, he tore off the frozen clothes, wrapped himself in blankets, and sat by the fire until his shaking turned into stillness. He survived, but the experience marked him deeply. For days afterward, he felt as if something inside him had changed, not in a way that could be seen, but in the rhythm of his thought, the cadence of his breath. He had faced the mountain but as a humble student, and it had shown him the thin line that separates control from surrender. The challenge had not been to conquer nature, to understand his place within it. When he returned to the lake a week later, the air was calm again. The openings he had carved had frozen over lightly, but beneath them the water moved freely. The fish had returned to their usual path, and life seemed restored. He built a small marker near the shore, a simple stack of stones, and thanked the mountain for the lesson. From that day forward, he treated every act, no matter how small, as part of a larger dialogue between himself and the world. But the discovery that came after was something he had never expected. While examining the edges of the lake, he noticed a faint trail leading north, half covered by snow. It was not made by any animal, he recognized. The steps were human, though light and deliberate, as if whoever made them knew how to move quietly through the forest. Intrigued, he followed them, walking for hours through the stillness until he reached a narrow clearing where the trees grew in perfect circle. At the center of that circle stood an old structure, half buried under years of snow and moss. It looked like the remains of a cabin, long abandoned. He stepped inside carefully. The roof had caved in, but one wall still stood, covered with faded carvings. He brushed away the frost and realized they were not random marks, symbols, lines, curves, and spirals resembling the flow of rivers. He studied them closely and saw that they mirrored the same movement patterns he had observed in the lake's fish over the years. Whoever had lived here had known the same secret. Perhaps another man had once called this mountain home, learning its lessons long before him. The thought filled him with a quiet joy. He was not alone in his understanding. Others had walked this same of silence and discovery. He gathered a few objects from the ruins, a small wooden carving of a fish, a rusted metal hook, and a piece of stone shaped like. Back at his cabin, he placed them on a shelf above the fire. They became symbols of continuity, reminders that wisdom is not owned by anyone, but shared across time through those who truly listen. From that winter onward, his ice traps evolved. Inspired by the carvings he had found, he refined their design, shaping them in harmony with the natural movement of the current. They became not mere tools, but extensions of the mountain's rhythm. He no longer thought of catching fish as an act of taking, but as a form of participation, a conversation between man and water. And though the villagers continued to visit and marvel at his success, he spoke less and less about how it worked. Some things, he knew, were meant to be understood through silence, not explanation. That winter's storm had changed everything. It had stripped away the last remnants of doubt from his heart and replaced them with unshakable trust. He no longer questioned why he was there, nor what he might have missed in the world below. The challenge had become the discovery that even in the harshest trial, there exists quiet grace waiting to be found. And perhaps, as you listen to this story, you too can sense that same truth, that every storm in your life hides a lesson meant only for you, that sometimes what seems like punishment is simply preparation for deeper understanding. The man on the mountain learned this not through comfort, but through cold, through silence, through surrender. And it is through those very moments that life reveals its greatest gifts. If this moment in his journey has spoken, if the silence of the mountain begun to whisper something into your own life, take a moment, be close, subscribe, keep walking with me, and let's continue together toward what comes next, the reflection on the world and the man. The years passed gently, folding one into another until the boundary between them became a mist rose lake each dawn. The man had stopped counting them long ago. Time, in the world of the mountain, did not move in a straight line as it does in the valleys below. It turned in circles like the season, like the slow dance of light across the peak, always returning but never repeating. He felt no need to mark anniversaries or birthdays, for he had become part of the same rhythm that guided the snowmelt, the wind, and the flight of birds. Each morning he woke with gratitude for another day, and each evening he rested without fear of what might come next. He often sat outside his cabin in the early light, watching the world unfold in its quiet perfection. The same stones that had once seemed cold and distant now appeared alive, their surfaces etched with tiny lines of time that caught the glow of sunrise. The trees, once just for firewood, had become old friends, guardians, whispered lessons in every rustle of their leaves. Even the storm, those fierce and humbling forces, now felt like his family. He no longer sought to avoid them, but to move within them, understanding that everything, even destruction, had its place in the order of things. As the seasons turned, he began to reflect more often on the world beyond the mountain. The memory of the valleys and of people returned to him like faded dreams. He thought of how men and women hurry through their lives, chasing comfort, control, while the most important truths remain unnoticed beneath the surface of their own existence. He remembered how the people in the village had once mocked his ice trap, how they had laughed at his patience, unable to see that his strange ways were not about catching fish, but about understanding balance. They had believed that survival came from domination, from forcing the land to yield. Yet he had learned that real survival is born from harmony, from moving with the world rather than against it. He began to wonder whether those who lived below ever felt the silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence full of meaning, the kind that allows one to hear the truth inside a heartbeat, the kind that stretches between snowflakes falling from the same cloud. Perhaps they did, in rare moments between one noise and another, but he knew that few ever stayed long enough to listen. Most were afraid of silence because it reveals too much. It shows you who you really are. And to see oneself clearly, without distraction, can be more frightening than any storm the mountain could summon. Sometimes he thought about what he would say if he could speak to them again. He would tell them that peace is not something to be found in possession or praise, that it does not come from abundance or approval, but from presence. He would tell them that all the noise they create is only an attempt to fill the space where silence, and he would remind them that the earth does not need to be conquered, it needs to be remembered. But he knew such words would be wasted unless spoken to those ready to hear. Understanding does not come through speech, it comes through experience. So he remained silent, letting his life be his answer. There was a night in late autumn when the moon rose full over the peaks, turning the snow into a sea of silver light. The man sat outside, wrapped in furs, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the lake. The air was cold enough to sting, yet he felt a strange warmth inside him. He realized that he no longer felt separated from anything, not from the earth beneath him, not from the sky above, not even from the people far away in their valley of noise. It was as if all the boundaries that once divided the world had dissolved. He was no longer the man observing the mountain. He was the mountain observing itself through human eyes. He remembered something he had once read long ago, before he left the cities behind. It said that to understand the world, one must learn to understand. Back then, it had sounded like a riddle. Now he saw that it was the simplest truth of all. The world and the man are reflections of each other, mirrors facing mirrors. The greed of men is mirrored in the scars they leave upon the earth, and the healing of the earth is mirrored in the quiet peace of a soul that has learned to let go. Every choice, every action, every word, each is part of a greater conversation between humanity and the land that stains it. He began to see this conversation everywhere, in the way the snow melted slower on shaded slopes, teaching patience, in the way the pine needles bent under frost, never broke, teaching resilience, in the way the river cut through rock, not by force, but by persistence, teaching humility. Even in the cycle of life and death, he found a message. When an old tree fell, it did not vanish. It became home to moss and mushrooms. It fed the soil, and through that, it gave birth to new life. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was truly gone. Everything changed form and continued. He wondered if the people below ever stopped long enough to see this. Perhaps they did not, because the world they had built ran on speed, not rhythm. They rushed from task to task, believing that movement meant progress. But the man had learned that stillness, too, is movement, the kind that flows inward rather than outward. In silence, he had traveled farther than he ever could with his feet. He had journeyed through the hidden valleys of thought, climbed the peaks of reflection, and crossed the rivers of memory. The mountain outside had taught him how to explore the mountain within. One morning, as he sat by the lake, a faint mist rose from its surface, curling like breath. In that moment, he realized how fragile the world truly is. All its beauty depends on balance, the balance between cold and warmth, between giving and taking, between life and death. Disturb one, and the others falter. It was the same with people. He thought about how much suffering comes from imbalance, from always wanting more, from never resting in enough. He had been guilty of it too. His journey to this mountain had not been a flight from others, but from his own noise. Only when he stripped himself of everything did he find what he had been seeking all along. Peace, not as an idea, but as a living presence. When he thought of the future, he did not imagine grand things. He did not dream of returning or of being remembered. His only wish was that when he was gone, the mountain would continue unchanged, breathing quietly as it always had. Perhaps one day another wanderer would find the old cabin and wonder who had lived there. Perhaps they would see the ice, the carved stones, and feel the same connection he once when he discovered the ruins of the man before. That would be enough, a silent continuity between souls, separated by time, but united in understanding. He often found himself speaking softly to the world, not with words, but with gestures. When he repaired the roof of his cabin, he thanked the trees that provided the wood. When he caught fish, he whispered gratitude to the lake. When he gathered herbs, he left part of the root behind so that life continued. These acts became his prayer. They required no church, no book, no ritual beyond awareness. The mountain was his temple, and existence itself his sacred text. There was wisdom in the simplicity of that life. The more he gave up, the more he received. The less he desired, the freer he became. He no longer feared death because he had seen it in so many forms: falling leaves, melting ice, the final ember of a fire fading into ash. And he knew that death was not an ending, but a transformation. The mountain would one day reclaim his body, just as it had reclaimed those who came before. His flesh would return to the soil, his breath to the wind, his thoughts to the quiet vastness of sky, and in that return there would be no loss. Sometimes he imagined what the world below might be like now. Perhaps it had grown louder, crowded, or restless. Yet he also believed somewhere within each lived a longing for the same silence. He liked to think that one day, when the noise became too much, someone would look up at the peaks and feel that calling, a soft tug in the heart, reminding them that peace is still possible, that it has always been waiting just beyond the last road. He smiled when he thought of that, because he knew that the mountain's lessons would never disappear. They lived in every wind, every shadow, every ripple of water. They lived in him, and they would live in whoever came after. For the world and the man are never truly separate. Each shapes the other endlessly. So when people ask, even now through stories passed down, what he discovered on the mountain, the answer is simple. He discovered that peace is not found in escape, but in acceptance. That wisdom does not come from knowledge, but from silence. That love, in its purest form, is not possession, participation in the life of everything around you. And perhaps that is what the mountain wanted to teach all along. If this reflection speaks to you, if you too have ever longed for a quieter truth beneath the noise of the world, then walk with me a little further. The path still stretches on toward the last part of the journey, the silence and the legacy. The years had softened him like water-shaped stone. What once had been a man among mountains had slowly become a mountain within a man, calm, unmoving, certain. His beard had turned completely white, his hands rough as bark, his eyes steady and full of that peculiar clarity only solitude grants. The cabin, though weathered by time, still stood firm, its walls darkened by smoke and years of winters. Inside, everything had found its place. The wooden bowls he carved himself, the fur-lined coat that had saved him through countless storms, the shelf with the small relics he had found at the ruins of another hermit's home. Every object carried the memory of touch and purpose. There was nothing he did not need, and nothing he needed more than what he already had. He no longer counted days or seasons. He simply lived them, one unfolding quiet into the next. The snow came and went. The lake froze and melted. The birds left and returned. The rhythm was eternal. Sometimes he wondered if he too had become part of that cycle, if perhaps the mountain would one day breathe him out like mist, dispersing gently the sky. The thought brought no fear, only gratitude. Death, he believed, was not an interruption, tenuation. The same energy that held the stars places would one day hold him. There were moments when he would wake or dawn, feel a strange stillness filling the air. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something unnamed. He would step outside and stand barefoot on the frost, looking toward the horizon. The stars would linger faintly above, and a thin line of pale light would begin to rise. In those moments, he felt the mountain was waking with him. He would close his eyes, breathe deeply, and feel the vast of everything moving through him. That was prayer, though he never called it. It was gratitude without words, worship without structure. It was simply being. As he aged, his body grew slower, but his mind clearer. He could sense the smallest change in the air before the weather turned. He could tell by the tone of the wind how long a storm would last. He could look at the surface of the lake and read it as one might read a familiar book. The world spoke to him constantly, and he had learned to listen without needing to. He had discovered that understanding was not a matter of speaking back, but of being still enough to let truth settle naturally. Sometimes he thought about the people in the valley, though it had been many years since he had gone down. He imagined that many of those who had once laughed at his ice trap are gone, their stories folded into new generations who might only know him as a legend. Perhaps parents still told their children about the quiet man who lived in the snow, who built strange traps that caught more fish than nets. Some might believe it, some might not. But he knew that stories, like rivers, never die. They simply find new paths through time. One summer, a group of travelers found their way up the trail and came upon his cabin. They were young, curious, full of energy. They had heard the stories and wanted to see if the man truly existed. When they found him sitting by the fire, they froze, surprised not by his presence but by his calm. He welcomed them without hesitation, offering tea and a place to rest. They asked him questions, hundreds of them, about life, survival, solitude, and truth. He answered a few, but most he left unanswered. When one of them asked him what the secret of his peace was, he simply said, "Listen." Then he pointed toward the window. Outside, the world was utterly still, the wind brushing softly through pine needles, the distant sound of water beneath the ice, the creak of old wood. The travelers fell silent, and for the first time in their young lives, they truly listened. Later, when they left, they carried this within them, and though they could not explain it, they knew inside the chain. The man watched them disappear down the path and smiled. He did not need to know what came of them. It was enough to know that silence had done its work once again. The mountain does not teach through words or promise. It teaches through presence. Whoever listens deeply enough becomes part of its wisdom, and that wisdom travels quietly, carried in hearts rather than in voices. The seasons continued their slow conversation. In his later years, he spent more time sitting by the lake than working. The ice traps still stood where he had placed them, glistening faintly beneath the surface each winter, but he rarely used them now. He needed little to live, and hunger had become a rare visitor. Instead, he spent his time watching the patterns of water and sky, the dance of reflection that blurred the line between above and below. He found endless fascination in those ripples, for they reminded him that all things mirror one another. Every action in the world, no matter how small, creates a wave that travels farther than we can. He thought often about legacy, though not in the way most men do. He did not dream of being remembered, nor of leaving behind monuments or names. He believed that true legacy is invisible, living in the hearts of those touched. Quiet example. If even one person learned to live more gently because of something he had done, that would be enough. If even one child grew up to look at the mountain with respect rather than conquest, that too would be enough. The rest, he knew, would take care of it. The mountain remembered everything. One autumn evening, when the first snow had just begun to fall, he sat by the fire and felt a deep stillness settle over him. His breath came slower, his heartbeat quieter. He knew without fear that his body was beginning its return to the earth. He placed another log in the fire, watched the flames rise, and whispered a soft thank you to the mountain, to the lake, to the wind, and to the years that had carried him here. Outside, the night grew deeper, the snow thickened, silence became almost luminous. In the morning, the cabin was quiet. The fire had burned to ash, and outside the world was clean and untouched. The villagers found him days later when they came to trade. He was sitting in his chair, eyes closed, a faint smile still on his face. It looked as though he had simply fallen asleep. They buried him near the lake, where the ice trap still shimmered faintly beneath the surface. Some said they saw fish gathering there in greater numbers that year, as if the lake itself mourned his passing. Over time, his story became part of the mountain's own memory. Travelers who passed through would sometimes feel a presence, a quietness that made them stop and breathe more slowly. The villagers said that if you stand by the lake at dawn and listen closely, you can hear the sound of water moving beneath the ice, the same rhythm that once guided the man's. Some believed it was the lake breathing. Others said it was the echo of the old hermit's heart, still beating in harmony with the world he loved. Seasons continued, they always do. The cabin aged, the wood softening with moss, the roof sagging gently. But the spirit of the place remained strong. Birds nested under its eaves, foxes took shelter nearby, and in spring the wildflowers grew brighter around the stones of his grave. The mountain had accepted him completely, and yet his legacy did not end there. In the valley below, one of the travelers who had once shared his tea began to tell the story again. At first to friends, then to strangers, then to anyone willing to. He spoke not of miracles or mysteries, but of the simple truth the hermit had taught through silence. He told them that there is wisdom in stillness, that the world does not need to be conquered. Slowly, others began to listen. Some took to walking the forest, speaking. Others found solace in the quiet between their own. The story spread far beyond the valley, carried by those who felt its calm take root in them. The man's life became more than a memory. It became a reminder, a living echo that traveled through time, calling each new listener to pause, to breathe, to see. The mountain, through him, had given the world its lesson that peace is not something to be found in the distance, but something already within, waiting to be remembered. And so his silence became his greatest gift, not a silence of emptiness, but of fullness, overflowing with meaning, patience, and understanding. It spoke without sound, teaching those who listened to slow down, to notice, to honor the rhythm that connects all things. If you stand by that lake today, in the early, you might still see the faint glimmer of ice on the surface, shaped by the same cold that once guided. You might feel the same breath of wind he felt on his face, and if you listen closely enough, you might hear the quiet voice of the mountain whispering his name, not as a man who disappeared, but as one who became part of everything he loved. That is the truth of his legacy. It is not a story about a man who escaped the world, but about one who finally understood it. His silence continues, unbroken, deep as the snow, light as the air, eternal as the peaks themselves. And if this story has found its way to you wherever you are, take a moment to breathe it in. Feel the calm it carries. Let it remind you that your own mountain, whether of stone, of life, or of heart, is waiting to be heard. And if it has touched you, leave a trace of it. Comment, share your thought. Let others feel that same peace. Subscribe so you can walk with me again through other mountains, other silence, other truths that live quietly behind the noise. For the mountain still speaks, and those who listen, even for a moment, become part of its endless story.